and assume I'm coming on the screen shortly. But let me thank you, Jacob, for this invitation, and thank Francis Bradley as well for the invitation to join you. And it's my honor to speak on the part of Indigenous communities in terms of how they're looking at the energy future of not only in Canada but globally. And what I would emphasize here is that uh, I don't think it's a question of choosing parties or sides, and I do take the points that there's some competition elements here. But I think we're creating a new energy market. We're creating a new set of energy solutions. And as a result, it's how we get there that's the issue. And what I would note is that Indigenous communities are also are already very big players in the energy market of Canada, both in the hydrocarbon sector and increasingly in the electricity sector. Today, Indigenous communities co-own, or have a defined financial interest with almost 20% of Canada's electricity generating infrastructure. Around 80 to 90% of all renewable energy projects that have been developed in the last decade and a half have had Indigenous partners, along with utilities, electricity sector companies, development companies, and others. And when we look at this future, there's a number of things that we see ahead that are particularly important. And what I would note is that it's not just renewable energy we're looking at from a broader clean energy standpoint. And in that regard, what I would note is that we see that the real key here is how energy storage will work and the integration between energy storage and the existing electricity infrastructure that we have. I think there's huge untapped potential for looking at how particularly our hydro base loads and at times our natural gas peaking base load is integrated with storage more significantly. And that's an area we believe is unexploited, undeveloped, and really is the way ahead for ensuring that our strong alliance on hydropower is exploited, but also accentuated with renewables being used for storage and coming into that space. We also think that we're going through a period of market innovation, and we can't be afraid of market innovation, which is a combination of dealing with climate and the net zero future, but also in terms of dealing with technology opportunity. And in that regard, we don't believe there's enough dialogue, both at the provincial or territorial level and nationally, to look at how market innovation will be different, how the markets will work differently as we have a more merging together of the energy markets from the fuels, from the hydrocarbon side, along with electricity, and how that fits, including new forms of storage like hydrogen. There is a major opportunity for Indigenous communities with diesel reduction for remote communities, and there are over 4 dozen major projects underway that will see us diversify away from diesel, not completely. Diesel is still a very important backbone for remote communities, but we will see around 40 to 50% of diesel reduced through renewables and efficiencies. And I do think that we talk a lot about generation, we talk a lot about supply, we don't talk about not about consumption. So from the standpoint there, we think there has to be as much attention played towards energy efficiency in housing and facilities and buildings, including in industry, as there should be on generation. And the real untapped potential that's there, and Indigenous communities are now very active in their own communities with regards to energy efficiency and housing. We do think there are four major policy issues or market issues that need our attention. First of all, it's our view that Indigenous communities are the natural partners with utilities, development companies, and energy companies in a net zero future. And in that regard, we think that this is not a competitive issue. This is more of a collaborative issue. So people have talked about competitive in the context of markets, and I appreciate that's a fact. But let's talk about how collaboration in terms of how new relationships work. If we're building a new energy market, what's the new set of relationships that we need? And Indigenous communities really want to be there at that table. That's going to require new planning approaches. I mean, the current approaches that most utilities take, for example, with fleet management and looking at supply, we don't think it's really vectoring the potential of technology, infrastructure investment, and how you bring consumers into the game and more diversified forms of energy. So let's look at a new planning structure as well for energy that will include regulators, but will also include suppliers, and governments have a key role, but we don't feel that's really being seized actively enough. People are more being hands off. We know there's huge unmet need in the electricity sector. We know there's infrastructure investment needed there, but sometimes you run right in the roadblock of rates. I mean, is it wrong to look at investment in a new energy market? I don't think so. I think it's exactly what we need to do. I think in part what we're doing is sitting on our hands in terms of saying, no, we want to keep rates low. We want to make sure supply is reliable, but we also want new technology, but new technology needs new capital investment. So we think part of this future is thinking of how the new capital investment models will work. We look at a very long tail. This may be a 20, 30, 40, 50-year capital investment situation where you're replacing the infrastructure today with the infrastructure of tomorrow. And finally, we think this, and this is what I really like about this session, Jacobs, there's a bit of knowledge sharing. There isn't enough knowledge sharing between jurisdictions in Canada, particularly in the electricity sector. We think one territory and province will keep to themselves rather than sharing with others. There's a lot of great things being done out there, and we're not learning enough from each other. So I would summarize as this, Jacobs, that Indigenous communities are at the table now. They own a lot of assets. They own hundreds of medium to large projects and thousands of smaller clean energy projects. And they want to do more in terms of efficiency, advanced energy systems, and green energy infrastructure. And they're moving to that space. So therefore, we think we need to have new forms of relationship, new forms of innovation planning, and new forms of policy, including the capital transition that allows us to move forward. Thanks very much.
Chris, I should have known you would have been characteristically succinct. Thank you for those comments. Folks, the rest of the people on the panel, questions for Chris?
Jake, it's Tim. I'll go on.
Go for it.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to see you. Appreciate the comments. And particularly noteworthy, I think, was your comment off the start about how engaged First Nations communities across the country are already in energy projects. And First Nations communities are actually some of the biggest proponents for new energy development right across the country. But that's often lost in the national conversation. And the perception is that First Nations are actually against resource development and if you will, on the side of those who don't want to see resources developed. Can you comment on why that is? Because I know through my sector, all kinds of First Nations voices that are very much in favor of continued development of our natural resources and think that voice is actually being muted.
Thanks, Tim, and good to see you again. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I find sometimes, particularly in the media, there's perhaps too much attention given to people against something and people who are loud about it. And so therefore, there is this perception that Indigenous communities are against natural resources development. I think the way to counter that really is to look at the realities on the ground, which I think you mentioned a couple around. And what I think was important, though, is to talk more about the how. And this is where I think there's learning we can all have. I mean, we're going to be putting something out in about 2-3 months, which talks about how you can move forward with clean energy, all forms of energy, by also making sure you achieve other goals that are protective of nature, goals that are protective of advancing economic development, of job creation in all spheres. And so I think we have to, in the energy sector, counter this view, this perception, I think, largely cultivated by the media, by sharing the experiences and the hard on the ground experiences that are good and how things have been done differently and how they're not only improving our energy infrastructure with Indigenous participation, but it's also yielding a range of other benefits that are social, that are health, that are environmental, and that's what we're seeing. And so we think there's a design issue as part of this evolution. And the best way we can change the message out there is to talk about the great things that are happening. And but I totally agree with you that Indigenous communities, in fact, are great supporters of natural resources development. In our case, particularly with clean energy. And the way we'll change that is by talking about it more and designing it better, so there's even more societal benefit as a result of the new energy future we're building.
Thanks, Chris.
Jacob, it's John. Do you mind if I weigh in here, even though I know I'm going to be speaking next? You mentioned, Chris is always concise, but he also has the ability to be penetrating like this and kind of reset good discussions. I think I'm really enjoying this part the most so far in this great exchange you've developed. I guess, Chris, what I'd say is to echo Tim's comment that your opening framing of this as it being a collaboration and partnerships needed to a new energy market. I think it's this transition phase that we have to talk about. There are visible tensions here between the various speakers in terms of the role of the different technologies. But if we look at it through your framework in terms of partnerships and collaborations towards a transition to a new energy market, I think that's what we're all striving for. And it's nice to have these increasingly aggressive targets that we set as a nation and we're setting as a world. But here in the Canadian context, we don't have the policy stability and the actual plan for getting there, right? I think the importance now is getting a plan in place that is going to give certainty to all technologies around what it is we're actually working towards, so that we can work together in partnership over a transition that is going to be fair for everyone, whether it's Indigenous communities or the existing workers in a particular fossil fuel sector, et cetera, but all recognizing that we're working towards that end goal together, and that by virtue of all of these technologies coming together, we'll be able to meet that end goal.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, John. And I do agree with you. I mean, to my mind, we have to be much more intensive about how we collaborate on this future we have to build. And frankly, we have to challenge governments. We have to challenge each other and to say, well, okay, we're going to collaborate on this. How do we do that? I mean, I would say to you that the current systems we have are completely inadequate to be able to get there. I mean, they're too jurisdictionally focused. They're not focused on the energy market we need to build, which has, and in fairness to Kathleen, there's huge opportunity in the new market, Kathleen. We don't have to have the pendulum swim back. We want to move forward in a completely new economic opportunity for new business opportunities. And so therefore we have to ask ourselves, well, how are we going to do that? And this is not a federal government thing. In fact, I think the federal government role, in my view, is principally about the capital transition that we need for investment in infrastructure. I do think that we have to work with provincial cousins, in both in regulators and in the political establishment and in governments to say, look, from an industry standpoint, we need to plan more intensively. And we need arbitrated approaches, mediation approaches. I mean, I think, John, for example, when you look at the things we use in society, we have alternative dispute resolution, we have mediation, we have arbitration, we have collective bargaining. We're doing none of that in the energy sector. We're actually not, in order to get to that collaborative approach, you need to have the mechanisms of change to do that. And that's something I think where we have to go to next.
If you don't mind, as the moderator, I want to exercise my prerogative again, and actually just, these are the kind of conversations we really want to try and host and promote at the Energy Council of Canada. And if you have a look at the first version of Canada's Energy Story, our annual compendium that we do, we reached out to our members and pulled in stories of progressive energy development across the sectors with Indigenous people. And we were flooded with stories. And it is one of these things I think everyone was alluding to in this conversation, is that, stories that may be a bit contentious or that may have some controversy surrounding them, of course, get played up in the media, and they get played up very strongly. All the other projects of them, scores of them, perhaps hundreds of them going on across the country where Indigenous people are partnered and leading, don't seem to attract the same kind of popular press ink. So it's up to us to help promote some of those stories. And it's through conversations like this that we can do it. And maybe the question to Chris is, what I also hear around the world too, is that, as much as we need to improve Indigenous relations in Canada and energy, we're also seen by others around the world as leaders in it. And what can we do to help share what we've learned and what we're doing with others who could benefit from it?
Thanks for that question, Jacob. We were very active at COP26 on that, and will be at COP27, 28 going forward. And the reason is that we think the major opportunity for being able to share things globally on the Indigenous side of things is related to renewable energy microgrids, because we think that's an opportunity for the Canadian supply chain, for developers, technology firms, and engineering firms, and utilities. So we're actually working with around 30 different communities in the world now, particularly in the Caribbean, Central and Latin America, on how they're transitioning into that space. And these are projects at scale. These are not micro or nano projects. These are true renewable energy microgrids at 1, 2, 20, 30, 40, 80 megawatts in terms of scale. So we think there's a great opportunity to move in there. That's part of the new approach to energy. Effectively, I think we need to go to cell phone technology versus landlines. I mean, and that's renewable energy technologies and microgrids that are more dynamic, more flexible, and not reliant maybe on major infrastructure investments as has been the case in the past. So that's one area that we're moving in. We think it's part of the climate solution for Indigenous communities, for island communities. And I will say that I think people may be surprised at the polling. You may think that the coverage is that we don't have much to share, or that we aren't doing a lot here in Canada in terms of Indigenous participation. Our numbers and polling showing differently. We actually see Canadians having a lot of appreciation as to how active Indigenous collaborators with utilities, with development firms, technology firms are part of the current state and the future state, and as well looking at that internationally. So we think that renewable energy microgrids are the big opportunity in that space, and there are many Canadian electricity sector firms moving into that space now.